Good afternoon. As usual, I'm here to make a short introduction and to invite you to another one of our Viking lectures. And not as usual, today's lecture will be held in English because we have a very special guest from the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. But before I introduce our guest, I'd like to remind you that all the lectures in our Viking series are still available after the transmission. You can go back to them at any time and watch them, for example, on YouTube. Please remember that during the lecture, you can communicate with us all the time using comment section to ask some questions to our guest. She is a professor of medieval Icelandic literature at the University of Iceland. Her main research activities focus on the Old Norse literature, especially legendary sagas, ballads, chivalry romances, or Icelandic poems called rimur. These are the texts in which legendary history and Christian worldview are blended with the glimpses of the Old Norse supernatural world. The notion of the supernatural world, the notion of magic and sorcery, is the subject of today's lecture by Professor Aðalheiður Guðmundsdóttir. Welcome, Aðalheiður. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Renata. And hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you. As Renata said, I am a professor of medieval Icelandic literature at the University of Iceland. Even if my field of research is quite broad and covers both literature and folklore, my speciality lies within the field of fornaldarsögur, or legendary sagas, and I've recently published 2 volumes about the roots of the sagas in European context, and I'm currently working on 2 more volumes. While these are written in Icelandic, I will hopefully be able to translate them in the future. When Renata asked me to give you a talk about my studies, I chose to talk about these sagas and how they present ideas about magic. In throwing light on both the fundamental elements of narratives and the laws governing their arrangement and interaction, narratology enhances our understanding of narratives as expressive vehicles. Besides, it can be useful in explaining our own thought process, what it is that happens when we express our opinions, worldview, and feelings in a connected narrative. This is illustrated by various studies where narratology has been applied with good results to narratives of different types. The practical value of this analytical approach is, however, probably best illustrated in studies of oral material, and particularly myths, legends, and fairy tales, which are usually characterized by formal regularity. The studies by Vladimir Prof, Algirdas Greimas, and Alan Dantes, all of which are based on oral material, are perhaps the best known, but they have been taken further by a number of more recent scholars. In my opinion, however, later theoretical revisions do not necessarily add much to the original approaches, but certainly they confirm the value of the original theories by applying them to new types of texts. Though textual analysis with narratological methods has received less attention, Roman Jakobsson and Peter Bogatyrev made important contributions in this direction in their comparison of oral tales and literary texts. Nevertheless, it is natural to apply narratological theories to literary works that are thought to be close to oral traditions, such as Icelandic medieval literature. Examples of this approach are the studies by Theodor Andersson on the sagas of Icelanders or Íslendingasögur, Joseph Harris of the short independent narratives interpolated in the sagas, Margaret Clunies-Ross of the Nordic myths, and Jörg Glauser of Icelandic romances. In this talk, I intend to focus on only one group of sagas, the Fornaldarsögur, by examining the narrative role of supernatural motives. Can we presume that they attest to actual folk belief, or were some of these ideas perhaps already fixed narrative motives at the time they were written, and to some extent stock features of the genre? My main question seeks to explore to what extent their authors employ witchcraft and magic, in Icelandic fjölkingi, for narrative purposes, such as controlling the plots of the sagas. This enables us not only to illuminate the nature of the magic that is described in these tales, but also to form an idea of the way audiences in the Middle Ages would have understood stories of people with magic powers. Furthermore, by applying narratological methods in the examination of these sagas, it may be possible to throw light on how the authors used oral material in their works. The most influential narratological theories within narratology are without doubt the analysis of functions by the formalist Vladimir Prof, in which he defined 31 functions in Russian wonder tales. According to his theories, these functions constitute 7 spheres of action among the dramatis personae, that of the villain, the donor, the helper, the princess and her father, the dispatcher, the hero, and the false hero. Another important theory is that of the semiotic square, representing the basic structure of signification proposed by the linguist Algirdas Greimas, who claimed that the signification of stories in general is dependent on oppositions, here modified or simplified to my own research on the Fornaldarsögur. According to Greimas' model, a typical story begins in a status quo where the hero is safe and sound. Soon he learns that a villain has acted against his interests through a negative act, if you follow the arrows on the slide, which leads to the state of danger or chaos. The hero responds to or attacks the villain through a positive act, and therefore changes the situation from danger to safety or status quo again. Thus, the hero needs the villain, just as the villain needs the hero, because without these opposite agents, there would be no conflict, and without conflict, there would be no story. This is not the place to give detailed account of Prof's and Greimas' theories, but one of the things these theories demonstrate is that the characters in oral tales, such as in fairy tales, are stereotyped and conform to the properties of their roles, which in turn depend on the structure of the tale. All stories have a certain structure, and the closer they lie to oral tradition, the simpler their structure is. This can best be seen in myths and oral fairy tales or wonder tales, the narrative structure of which is thought to be closest to what has been termed as the basic structure of signification. Other relevant theories when considering literary texts like the Icelandic Fornaldarsögur include Claude Lévi-Strauss's studies of the structural nature of myth, which in many ways correspond to theories of linguists such as Noam Chomsky and other scholars of cognitive science. My talk today is inspired by these theories, and I will apply some of them to the narrative material to some extent. But first, let us call to mind the main features of the narratives under consideration. Within Icelandic medieval literature, the fornaldarsögur, also called fornaldarsögur Norðurlanda, or the legendary sagas of the North, are possibly the genre that is closest to oral tradition and can be regarded as a goldmine for research into the boundary between oral and written literature. The fornaldarsögur were mostly written in the 13th and 14th centuries. The actual material on which the authors of the original sagas drew, however, is evidently much older. Though scholars disagree about the delineation of the fornaldarsögur and even whether they constitute a separate genre, I think it is safe to see them as a distinct category of medieval Icelandic literature, since they differ from other categories in a number of ways. One of the disputed issues is the extent to which the authors drew on oral tradition. I don't know if you are familiar with fornaldarsögur or not, but in short, they deal with the heroic deeds of kings and chieftains in Scandinavia before the settlement of Iceland, and some of whom we may call Vikings. Some of the most famous sagas include Völsunga saga, Ragnar's saga Loðbrókar, or the saga of the Viking Ragnar Loðbrók, Hervara saga og Heiðreks, Héðins saga og Högna, Göngurhólfs saga, and many more. One of the distinguishing features of the fornaldarsögur is that they contain many more supernatural events than most other sagas, and therefore abound with supernatural creatures, people with magic powers, and fjölkingi, or magic, of various types. It has been argued that the supernatural features of these sagas become more plentiful as time progresses. It may indeed be possible to demonstrate this through comparative studies, but this is far from being a hard and fast rule. The least credible sagas are not necessarily the most recently composed. On the contrary, some of the older sagas include memorable examples of magical elements. But how are we to account for the substantial and important presence of supernatural beings and people with magic powers in the world of the fornaldarsögur? Something that may be important in this context is the physical distance between the world of the sagas and that of their audience. It was probably never the intention that the fornaldarsögur were to be taken seriously, or at least not to the same extent as other saga genres, such as the sagas of Icelanders, the Íslendingasögur, and the contemporary sagas. The fornaldarsögur differ from these genres in that they generally take place before the settlement of Iceland, and as they are set in Scandinavia or even more remote regions, they are at greater remove from their audience, both in time and space, than those that are set in Iceland. Although there is in fact much to suggest that people regarded the fornaldarsögur as stories about their distant ancestors, this dislocation resulted in the times that they describe being swathed in mist, with the world of the marvelous never far away. In the same manner, the past always seems to be more accommodating to witchcraft and magic. As Stephen Mitchell has pointed out, there is relatively little witchcraft in the contemporary sagas, in which the subject is the author's own age, while the authors of the fornaldarsögur are dealing first and foremost with the past, even though the sagas themselves obviously spoke to their audience through their picture of the past. In other words, the magic depicted in the fornaldarsögur can be related directly to their origin in oral tradition and the age of the material, and of course to an attempt on the part of the authors to create the atmosphere of a world long past, a pre-Christian age, which stands in opposition to the Christian contemporary world. Although admittedly the sagas of Icelanders also dealt, like the Fornaldarsögur, with the past, it was much closer in time to the medieval audience, and the setting was of course familiar to them in a very real manner. This difference in the nature of the relationship between saga and reality can be seen from the fact that while figures in the sagas of Icelanders who have magic powers are individuals who live on particular farms in the inhabited areas of the country, those of the Fornaldarsögur, including trolls, dwarves, and other supernatural creatures, are generally encountered in wild places and therefore resemble folklore phenomena more than any part of the human community. Of course, the distinction is not quite so clear-cut. There are all sorts of practitioners of magic in the Fornaldarsögur, including prophetesses, isolated recluses who practice magic in secret, chieftains who perform sacrifices to the pagan gods, counselors who accompany heroes and help him in battle, and shapeshifters who fight in human or animal form or sink into the ground and appear elsewhere. Though beings with magical powers can sometimes be helpers, they are usually enemies of the saga heroes, belonging to the sphere of the willing, and magic in itself can often be regarded as the opposite of real heroism. In terms of Gramsci's scheme, those who possess magical knowledge tend to be in impaired oppositional relationships with the heroes. In other words, their role is generally related to the negative act, and their actions result in a shift towards a state of imbalance. In the same way, they are closely related to functions 4 to 8 and 18 and 30 in Prop's analytical system. As a result, people or supernatural beings with magic powers seem to have been ideal as a foil to highlight the superiority of the heroes. In studies of the worldview of Old Norse literature, scholars have sometimes referred to supernatural beings and events as constituting an other world, which is located either outside or inside the world of the saga. Certainly, in the case of the Fornaldarsögur, the distinction between these two worlds is far from clear. Sometimes it is to some extent geographical, such as when the heroes sail to the north and east and become further and further distanced from the known world, the Norse world of Scandinavia. In other instances, the division can be made by features in the landscape itself, for example, by water, such as a lake, fog, or islands, or by the transfer of the scene of the action to distinct location, such as inside of a cave or a mound. In some ways, this is a different world of trolls and magical beings, but still it is far from being a homogeneous otherworld. With the boundaries between these two worlds being so indistinct in many ways, it is also no easy matter to draw a distinction between the nature of events that take place in the hero's familiar world, on the one hand, and in a supernatural setting on the other. Some scholars have nevertheless tried to define the other world as being a pure fantasy world, for example, because in it magic is used in a thoroughgoing fashion. This view has, however, been increasingly criticized, and some scholars argue that even if the Fornaldarsögur include tales of supernatural heroes, monsters, and magic, we should not treat them as fantasies, as they exhibit remnants of folk belief where magic had an important role. One thing is certain, that the supernatural dimension of the Fornaldarsögur is something that merits study in itself, and it is likely that an analysis of this material can increase our understanding of the worldview of 13th and 14th century Icelanders. We should also be able to use these sagas to gain an insight into their audience's knowledge of the past, though in most cases we can assume that they reflect first and foremost their ideas about the past. All in all, the fornaldarsögur are stories about the past, and so the scenarios of the past to which the authors and audiences turned are what is important when we consider their worldview and their attitudes to magic. It is evident that magic incidents and motives play an important role in the fornaldarsögur, but to analyze this role effectively, it is important to answer basic questions such as, what does it mean to be fjölkunnugur or possessing magical knowledge in the sagas? Do the sources provide a coherent image of those skilled in witchcraft and magic, or must we turn to other medieval texts to complement the fragmentary information obtained in the fornaldarsögur? One must of course be wary of assuming here that ideas about witchcraft and magic were any more clear-cut in medieval times than they are today, and it is uncertain whether the ideas reflected by the sagas can be elucidated or complemented by other sources. Let us begin by looking at the vocabulary. It is sometimes said that the large number of words in Icelandic denoting different aspects of the weather is a reflection of the importance of the weather in daily life in Iceland throughout the ages, and the fact that it is a more or less evergreen subject of conversation. In other words, terminology for phenomena that are commonly talked about is likely to be varied and to be well preserved. This seems to be the case with magic in the fornaldarsögur. The single term magic, or fjölkingi, seems to be far from sufficient to cover all aspects and nuances of the topic. The most common synonyms or near synonyms are brögð, feikn, forneskja, galdur, gjörningar, konstur, kukl, kunnátta, kingi, list, seiður, trölldómur, tröllskapur, töfrar, and vísdómur. Words for actions employed in the practice of fjölkingi include efla, gala, kasta á, leggja á, magna, rista, rýna, and seiða. If the number of terms used in the sagas can be taken as an indication of their audience's familiarity with magic or with ideas regarding magic through the medium of saga entertainment, then it would seem to have been very common. But what was involved in the magic described in the sagas? Before we consider the role of fjölkingi in the sagas, we must consider the types of magic it covers. Francois Xavier Dillman divides his study of magic in medieval Icelandic sources, one of the most extensive studies of magic in the Nordic countries to appear in recent years, into two parts, one on magic in various contexts, the other on persons who practice it. He begins the first part with an examination of divination and then turns to three categories of magic proper, which are applicable to the fornaldarsögur, even though Dillman's study draws largely on the sagas of Icelanders and is therefore not always concerned with comparable manifestations of magic. These categories are shown on the slide. It is appropriate here to take a closer look at the magic itself as depicted in the fornaldarsögur and in terms of Dillman's three categories. Magic or fjölkingi in connection with warfare and weapons. Since the world of the fornaldarsögur is one in which there is frequent armed conflict over power and riches, it is hardly surprising that we find magic frequently employed for the purpose of acquiring and maintaining power. The heroes acquire magic tunics and other items of clothing, and also weapons that have magic properties. Some of these are the products of supernatural creatures, particularly dwarves, while others have spells cast on them or are steeped in poison. Various types of magic devices that are not strictly weapons are also used in warfare. For example, helmets that render the wearer invisible, tents, and ships. Magic in connection with the body and the soul. Magic of this type is very plentiful in the sagas, often connected with military operations and struggles of power. Shape-changing is the most common type, followed by unusual physical abilities such as supernatural strength, immunity to poison, and immunity to weapons. The category also includes spiritual skills such as astral traveling, abilities such as casting spells, pronouncing magic formulae, and the power to exert magic influence through one's eyes, and even the ability to learn magic skills. Supernatural healing abilities come under this category, as does the ability to make people enamored of someone, this being essentially the ability to command the will of another person. And finally, magic in connection with the 4 elements, particularly as regards the weather and natural magic. The most common manifestation of this type of magic in the fornaldarsögur is weather magic. For example, unexpected storms, fog, etc., which are caused by the magician. Others include the production of darkness, smoke, invisibility, traveling through the ground, and fire. Stones, silk, herbs, and other natural objects and substances are used in magic in this category as means of intervening in the normal workings of the natural world. As in other sources, depictions of natural magic of this type reflect not only people's longing to gain control over the forces of nature, but also their recognition of a need to know better and understand these important forces. While a depiction of magic in the fornaldarsögur can be analyzed in terms of a different kind of system, Dillmann's tripartite division provides a good overview of the material and the variety of narratives describing fjölgengi. There are various kinds of sources from different times that attest to magical belief systems, such as ecclesiastical writings, ancient law books, judicial documents, and literature. While it is safe to say that the fornaldarsögur reflects some of the ideas that Icelanders of the 13th and 14th centuries had about witchcraft and magic of past ages, as indicated, for example, by the number of terms pertaining to magic, we can also argue that they contain traces of even older ideas, as can be seen if these narratives are compared with sources of other types. It is important, however, to remember that the fornaldarsögur, like all narratives, adhere to certain narrative principles that may, in some respect, be characteristic for the category or the genre itself. It is necessary, therefore, to question in this context whether, and if so, then in what way, witchcraft and magic are employed as a literary convention. It is evident that characters skilled in witchcraft or supernatural beings from another world to some extent serve to provide some kind of magical solutions and thus have a specific function in the narrative pattern of the sagas. But to what extent? We might ask, for example, whether a magical sword, and thus also the person skilled in magic or the supernatural being that gives it power, only has the narrative function of creating the preconditions for certain circumstances or scenes, such as the demise of a certain hero. May be that the author resorts to the use of the motive simply because he needs an excuse or reason for slaying, and that magic therefore constitutes, in fact, a structural element. Put another way, what is the narrative role of items pertaining to the supernatural world of the sagas? Can we say that supernatural motives are restricted to the narrative function, or do the underlying ideas also somehow reflect the society of the time when the sagas were told or written? Or is the magic of the past times depicted for purposes of entertainment? And might this explain the popularity of the genre? It can be seen from a great number of examples that magic is used to control the plot, that is, to set scenes and advance the action. For example, the enchanted sword Tyrfingur gives shape to the story of Herbarar saga og Heiðreks, leading to the death of the main characters one by one until Angantýr Heiðreksson is left as the last of his line. Then the role of the sword is complete. Nothing remains to be told about it, and the saga ends. But for Tyrfingur to play such a dominant role, it was necessary that a curse be put on it, conferring on it its special powers. Curses are one of the most popular narrative devices employed in the fornaldarsögur and in other traditional tales to advance the action. They enable the author to create circumstances that determine the subsequent development of the entire plot, that is, to function as a sort of narrative framework. The most famous example of this is the curse laid on the gold by the dwarf Andvari in Völsunga saga, the consequence being that all those who come to possess it will thereby meet their death. From that point onwards, the curse of the gold hovers over the saga heroes and runs through the saga, causing dissension, betrayal, and gruesome deeds. Curses and spells have a similar function in fairy tales, creating the baleful circumstances or a particular challenge to be overcome by the hero. The curse in fairy tales form part of the stereotyped structure, being part of the sphere of action of the villain, the party who upsets the state of equilibrium in the story according to the theories of Prof and Greimas, and giving the occasion for the actions that will restore it. In both cases, the curses can be seen as a sort of catalyst that sets the action in motion. In more complicated narratives, however, such as the fornaldarsögur, they are also a means used by the author to provide the protagonist the experience he needs in order to prove himself as a hero, and therefore to move him along the path towards a higher state of development. While some authors clearly use spells and curses as the basis and dynamic force in their stories, setting in motion a series of events that elicit more mature behavior from their heroes, they can function as something more than a structural device. When people who have had spells cast on them lose their independent will, they become tools in the hands of the caster of the spell. In this condition, they do things they would not normally do, and it is by this means that the magician creates a set of circumstances that would otherwise be difficult to establish. As an example, is the potion of oblivion that Grímhildur gives Sigurður Fáfnisbani in Völsunga saga, which makes him forget Brynhildur and marry Guðrún. By making the hero the victim of magic spell, the author absolves him from responsibility, and the audience does not blame Sigurður for not behaving in a proper moral fashion. Thus, it can be said that magic can be a device used by the author to keep the audience's sympathy where he wants it. In other words, he uses it to control the audience's reaction. The reader or hearer of the story can be relied upon not to think that Sigurður has willingly betrayed Brynhildur, even though he now loves another woman. This leads to a complicated situation in which the role of the villain, as the betrayer of the bonds of love, has been transferred to a third person, the practitioner of magic. This arrangement also ensures that the new object of Sigurður's affections, Guðrún, is also free of responsibility for the situation. From the point of view of the audience, Brynhildur is therefore not the only victim of this love triangle. So too is the man who has betrayed her, and so is his new woman friend. By using devices like this, the author can make the audience aware of moral questions, for example, whether, and if so when, harmful deeds or crimes are under the person's control, and when a person no longer really controls his or her own conduct, but is caught in a net woven by others. This is not to say that all those who enjoyed Völsunga Saga in medieval times understood the procedure in this way, but certainly the possibility lies within the text. Many other incidents can be interpreted in a similar way. In Héðin's Saga og Högna, Héðin abducts Hildur, Högni's daughter, as a result of a spell cast on him by a goddess, and consequently does not play the role of an ordinary villain. The same applies to young women who are cursed and turned into dangerous trolls. For example, Signy in Illuga Saga Gríðarfóstra, who is forced by the evil curse to act as a murderer. Or Lofthæna in Gríms Saga Lóðinkinna, who is only a temporary villain due to the curse of her stepmother. The same applies to the use of magic in a broader context. By using magic, saga authors can change the laws governing the development of the story, because once magic makes its appearance, the audience is not able to demand logical explanations of cause and effect in the same way as it can under normal circumstances. As I have already mentioned, practitioners of magic are generally in the role of the opponents of the hero, and thus the function of magic tends to demonstrate and emphasize the strength and virtue of the hero. It comes as no surprise how often the heroes of these stories have to contend with supernatural hazards and magical powers, since these provide choice occasions for illustrating their superiority. A consequence of the simplification involved in analysis by narratological methods is the impression that the practitioners of magic in the sagas are completely stereotyped and therefore shorn of personal character. This is by no means the case. A survey of the Fornaldarsögur reveals that magic is practiced by characters as diverse as berserks, dwarves, evil beings, foster fathers and foster mothers, giants, goddesses, inhabitants of the far north, kings and queens, priestesses, princes and princesses, prophetesses, trolls, semi-trolls, sorcerers, stepmothers, and other supernatural beings. Thus, the practitioners themselves are far from being standardized. The same applies to fjölkingi per se, for instance, spells and curses. Although its role is restricted in narratological terms, as for example, to set the action in motion in the light of props function number 8, this does not mean that it is not diverse in nature and cannot reflect actual ideas that people had and older beliefs, even if the ideas are to a large extent stereotyped and the wording tends to be formulaic. Although only a few examples of the role of magic in the Fornaldarsögur have been examined in this talk, they show that the ideas involved may be rooted in older notions regarding magic, and so correspond with accounts in sources of other kinds, and may even throw new or clearer light on them. But how can we explain the existence of these traditional ideas in the world of the Fornaldarsögur? Folklore studies have generally demonstrated that ideas live where there is a receptive environment for them. Seeds transmitted from one place to another will not grow into plants, and far less into a local species, unless the right climate and soil conditions exist for them. The same can be said about a set of ideas that are transmitted from one age to another. It seems that the authors and audiences of the Fornaldarsögur provided the ideal soil for keeping alive old ideas about magic. But tellers of tales and those who listen to them are scarcely concerned with preserving subject matter. They use it for making stories and being entertained, and they use it to spice up the narratives and make the world they describe more interesting. It was for these purposes that remnants of old beliefs acquired a new role, and in fact, the most common literary motifs do not necessarily preserve older or more realistic ideas than those that are preserved in only one or two variants. Although curses and spells and other magic devices came in useful when a plot needed to be set in motion or the author needed to enlist the sympathy of the audience for a particular character, there is nothing to indicate that the audience ever believed that people capable of casting spells actually existed in large numbers around them. Thus, narratology can enable us to analyze the role of magic in literature and how it can be employed in a narrative device in the hands of the saga author. Detailed examination and comparison can demonstrate what ideas recur again and again, and thus what notions of magic people had in the 13th and 14th centuries. Whether the Fornaldarsögur reflect what people really believed or understood about magic is open to debate. In this talk, however, I have illustrated that the large number and diversity of terms and the countless variants of individual motives stand as an indication of how firmly established these ideas were. They would not have been so had they not been current in our culture over a long period. In other words, it is not unlikely that notions that Icelanders of the 13th and 14th centuries had about witchcraft and magic of past ages actually reflect remnants of actual magic practices to some extent. On the other hand, we must take into account the fact that saga authors could have used magic in different ways, even though they were writing within the same tradition. Thus, they could have referred to older ideas while at the same time giving their imaginations free rein as long as they operate within the existing conceptual framework. Turning to the main question of my talk, we have now tried to examine in what way authors employ witchcraft and magic for narrative purposes, and from the discussion, it may be deduced that magic is indeed generally used to fulfill a certain narrative function. It seems clear that the authors use magic to provide the hero with an opposite number, an opponent in the plot. Bolster the hero's moral standing, for example, by presenting magic in contrasts to the heroic ideal. Present a picture of pre-Christian times. Spice the narrative, so enhancing its entertainment value. In all cases, the setting of the past is of great importance, and as studies have shown, medieval authors tended to use magic more freely in their depictions of former times. The Fornaldarsögur took their audiences out of their real environments and away from the restrictions that governed their daily lives. This dislocation gave the authors freedom to create stories full of supernatural events, which tell us a lot about our own society, even though they are so far removed from it that they obey other rules that are self-consistent in their setting. Thus, we can say that the authors of the Fornaldarsögur used magic for narrative purposes, and that the audiences of these sagas were receptive to ideas of this type. It should be noted that the conclusions presented here are based only on specific sources within the fields of Icelandic literature, and therefore reflect primarily the ideas to be found here, and not notions of magic practices or attitudes to magic in a broader context. The examples examined nevertheless permit us to conclude that even though the practice of magic as described in the Fornaldarsögur may reflect traditional or older ideas about magic, the art of the storyteller and saga writer lay in how they used magic for narrative purposes. The further the time and geographical setting of the Fornaldarsögur was removed from that of the community that formed them, the easier it was to employ magic as a way of telling meaningful stories, entertaining an audience, or simply composing an exciting plot. It is therefore natural to assume that one of the reasons, at least, for the presence of such a number of supernatural beings and people with magic powers in the world of the Fornaldarsögur is that they offered the authors easy as well as entertaining solutions in the composition of their works. Now, if you wish to know more about my research on magic and the supernatural in Old Norse literature, you can visit my academia page and perhaps read my latest article on enchantment and anger in medieval Icelandic literature and later folklore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aðalheiður. Now we encourage our audience to ask questions to our guest. I guess someone has to start, so I have a question. Where does this approach to magic as a narrative device come from? I mean, is it purely an Icelandic invention, or maybe there are some traces of foreign influences, of foreign literature? How do you see it?
Well, when I was teaching some fundamental courses in just like folktale theories, I of course taught narrative theories, and I taught structuralism and a wide variety of methods that my students could then apply to folktales specifically, or oral material. And the more, the often I used these theories in class, nobody was using them in the research because they are quite old. So I was fascinated with these ideas, and I thought that if I wanted to present them to my students, I would have to have something like later or newer. So I began to read what people had written about narratology and how people developed these ideas. And I found out that I really wanted to teach my students, the original theories. And then in my own research, I began to apply these theories on folktales. I was especially treating folktales, like Icelandic fairy tales that are very full or rich of curses. If you would ask somebody in Iceland what makes Icelandic fairy tales different from the fairy tales of other European nations, they would probably say, well, they are so full of enchantment and curses that you might think that every other Icelander is always under a curse and waiting to be saved. So I saw this as a pattern throughout our fairy tales, and I began to apply these theories to the fairy tales, and this was very illuminating. And in my study about the magic in the Fornaldarsögur, I'm just trying experimental way to apply it to a different kind of storytelling material, but I haven't seen anybody applying this to magic before. But in this case, I mean, the Fornaldarsögur are very exceptional because they are medieval, and they include so many features of supernatural events and characters with magical properties. So I would also think that these tales or these sagas would be where to start if you wanted to apply these kind of methods. So no, I don't have any any research that that inspired me with magic.
Okay. I have another one question, but I'm sorry, it goes further. It goes beyond legendary sagas. I'm just curious if how did the role of magic change in later times? For example, in Icelandic Age of Fire, the persecutions of witches. I wonder maybe this role became, I don't know, more sinister or something like that. How did it change?
Well, if we are talking about the 17th century, especially the age of witchcraft, you find that in Iceland, again, we have like a kind of different situation than elsewhere in Europe, because the people who were burned for magical practices in Iceland were in majority men, not women. They were like can't be well. The numbers are people do not agree exactly about the numbers, but we don't have so many people actually burned. But some say
20.
like 20 men, 1 woman. Some say 2 or 3 women, but it depends on how you look at the cases. But the majority were men. And some scholars, they just say that we can never understand why this was so here in Iceland. But in fact, my view, even if I haven't like written about it or anything, is that if you have a good knowledge in the medieval literature, you begin to understand why ideas about magic is developed in Iceland in different ways, and that magic was still very closely connected to some kind of learning. So, you know, when in the 17th century, a man was like captured and burned at the stake, it might have been because he owned a small manuscript with a magical stave on it. So the people that were the men that were accused of witchcraft in the 17th century, they usually had something like some possession of learned knowledge. They had small manuscripts, so they were collecting kind of incantations and so on. So there is some kind of boundary there between the medieval sagas and literature. And if you read like the Fornalda saga, the Fornalda sögur, you can see all kinds of supernatural people, as I told you. But when you read like the Íslendinga sögur, the sagas of Icelanders that are much more like closer to the reality, there you see that people who practice magic they're like these wise people. They possess knowledge, and they can write runes and read runes and so on. So I think this medieval tradition, we can see it again in the 17th century. And it partly may explain why the victims of the witch hunt were men who could read and could like use runes.
I think that a funny example is Saemund the Wise, because he was supposed to be so wise that he had to be a sorcerer, right?
Yeah,
it's a funny connection between the knowledge and the sorcery.
Yeah, that's right.
We have a question from the audience. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I have one question. What kind of supernatural events are the most often in these sagas?
It depends on, like I am today talking about Fornalda sögur, so I would say the most frequent like events are curses. You meet somebody who lays curse on you. And this is also like very interesting from the narrative point of view, because just imagine like being an author in the Middle Ages, and you just wanted to create a story with all kinds of entertaining elements in it, you could just start by having the character, the hero, meeting somebody who lays curse on him. And then you have the story. This is just like we know from fairy tales, but in the fornaldarsögur, this is more complicated. If I was talking about the chivalric romances or the riddarasögur, we would have slightly different kind of magic. Well, the magic in the riddarasögur hasn't been researched that much, but from my idea and feeling, it is that in the riddarasögur, the chivalric tales, the magic is a bit more learned. And then in the Íslendingasögur, Sagas of Icelanders, you would have more like people practicing magic. But for example, shape changing or shape shifting, that is rather common in Icelandic magic. People appearing in the body of an animal, for example. But these ideas about shape changing, for example, the werewolves or the werebears, they are also very much closely related to Iceland, to ideas about berserks or warriors who identify themselves with wild animals. So there is a connection between ideas and how the ideas are then presented in sagas, where people are not just similar to animals, but they turn into animals. So this would be very very common in both the fornaldarsögur and the riddarasögur. But these ideas of like actual shapeshifters would not be, for example, very often presented in the Íslendingasögur, even if there are examples there. And then in what we call contemporary sagas that are supposed to happen at the same age when they were written, we don't have like shapeshifters, because that the sagas are simply too close to the audience. And that's why the past is so important. So I would say shapeshifters and curses, and very often curses and shapeshifters go together. For example, you meet somebody, you meet an evil stepmother who turns you into a wolf, for example, with a curse.
Okay, thank you very much. It seems that we don't have more questions. So thank you once more for a very interesting lecture. Thank you for an interesting discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for listening to me, even if you don't have many questions now. I can just tell you that the fornaldarsögur, it is fun to read them, and they are becoming more and more like popular for scholars and students to study. And if you like what we may call Viking culture, then the fornaldarsögur would probably be the sagas that are or could be the most of interest for you, besides, of course, the mythology. But yes,
they influence fantasy writing a lot, right? For example, Tolkien's writings.
Yes. I mean, Tolkien was fascinated with the fornaldarsögur, and when I as a person who know all of the fornaldarsögur, if I read Tolkien or look at his at the movies or whatever, I'm constantly recognizing some motifs that Tolkien must have taken from certain sagas. This is very exciting also.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much, Aðalheiður.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.